My son-in-law took my truck without asking, put a 4-inch dent in the rear quarter panel, and when I asked him about it, he shoved me backward into the mudroom doorframe, hard enough to knock my hat off the hook. My daughter was standing at the top of the stairs. She looked at the floor. That evening, I went out to the shop, turned on the lights, and stood at my workbench for a long time thinking about what I was going to do. 2 days later, I told them both that I had decided it was time to talk seriously about transitioning the business. If you have ever spent 4 decades building something from nothing, only to have someone decide that your life's work was theirs to take, this story is for you. Please hit the like button and subscribe to Revenge Hours. Now let me tell you about the most expensive miscalculation my son-in-law ever made. My name doesn't matter. What matters is what I built. 39 years ago, I started a log home construction and timber frame company out of a steel roof shop on 3 leased acres in the Ottawa Valley. I was 24 years old. I had a 1987 Ford pickup that burned oil, a chainsaw I'd bought secondhand from a man in Arnprior, and a stubbornness that my late wife always said was either my greatest strength or my worst flaw, depending on the season. I named the company after the limestone ridge behind our property, the long ridge that runs above the Ottawa River and turns pink in the autumn light. I've been watching that ridge from my shop window for nearly 40 years. It looks different in every season and the same in every year, and it has never once lied to me about what time it was or what kind of weather was coming. My wife and I built the business and built our family at the same time. Our daughter was born the same spring I landed my first full log home contract, and she grew up in sawdust and coffee steam and the sound of a timber frame being raised. She knew how to read a building permit before she knew how to drive. When her mother passed 7 years ago, cancer, 11 months from diagnosis to the end, the kind of time that is both too long and not nearly enough, it was just the 2 of us, and the company, and the ridge and the 38 people who showed up to work every morning and depended on us. I held it together the way you hold a frame together when the weather turns on you, one joint at a time, one day at a time, making sure the load was distributed right so nothing buckled. My daughter met her husband at a conference in Ottawa. He worked in what he described as strategic business consulting, a phrase I have learned means different things to different people. To him it seemed to mean knowing how to dress for a meeting, having a firm opinion about everything, and billing clients for conversations. He had an MBA, which he mentioned often, and a handshake designed to establish dominance, which I noticed immediately and chose to ignore. He had opinions about my business from the first holiday dinner. Quiet suggestions at first. Maybe I should consider modernizing the quoting system. Maybe I should look at succession structures. Maybe the company's growth potential was being limited by its current management approach. I listened. I'm from the Ottawa Valley. We listen before we speak. I thought he was trying to impress me the way young husbands do. I confused ambition with insight, and that was my first mistake. 18 months ago, they moved into the house. My daughter had just gone through a difficult pregnancy. She lost the baby at 5 months, and she needed to be close to family, and I have 4 bedrooms and a paid-off mortgage, and I am not the kind of father who asks his child what she needs when the answer is obvious. My son-in-law's consulting practice had hit what he called a transitional period, which appeared to mean most of his clients had found other arrangements. 6 months became a year became almost 2. Somewhere in the second year, my son-in-law began treating the property as though it were his, using my tools without asking, parking across the shop entrance, bringing friends by on weekends to look at the equipment with a proprietary air I couldn't quite name. He started showing up at the shop on weekday mornings asking questions about the client contracts, about the equipment valuation, about the parcel. We own 4 acres outright now, land I bought from the original leaseholder in 2003, and the edge of it fronts a municipal corridor that a developer had been trying to acquire for a mixed-use project for 3 years running. He asked me what I'd been offered. I told him. I answered everything because I thought family meant something I apparently needed to reconsider. The Tuesday everything changed, my bookkeeper, Doris, a woman I hired 22 years ago when she walked in off the street with a resume and the most organized binder I'd ever seen, pulled me aside before I'd even taken my jacket off. She told me she couldn't balance the accounts payable from the previous quarter. $43,000 had moved through a vendor account she had no authorization for. Not in one transfer, in 12. Always just under the reporting threshold. Always to a numbered company she couldn't locate in the Ontario Business Registry. I told her to pull everything and lock it down. She handed me a folder that afternoon, and I sat in my office for 2 hours going through transfers, payment confirmations, a set of invoices that referred to services I didn't recognize from vendors I'd never hired. I know my accounts the way I know my timber inventory. I know when something doesn't fit. I didn't say anything that evening. I came home and ate dinner and passed the potatoes and asked my granddaughter about her day. She is 7 years old, serious and observant, with her grandmother's eyes and my habit of going very quiet when she is thinking hard about something. She had just been chosen as the junior statistician for her school's hockey pool, a role she had apparently lobbied for during recess, and she explained the entire projected bracket to me with a spreadsheet she'd drawn by hand in her notebook. I looked at her careful columns and her tidy numbers and I thought, I am not going to blow up this child's world until I know exactly what I am dealing with. 3 weeks later, I knew exactly what I was dealing with. The shove happened on a Saturday. I had spent the morning at the shop going through the accounts with Doris, and when I came home, my truck was gone. My personal truck, a 2019 Ram I'd bought with the intention of keeping for 10 years, the one with the company decal on the rear glass and the fishing rod still in the bed. I called my son-in-law. He said he'd borrowed it to drive some friends to the game in Ottawa, should be back by 9. He got back at 11. There was a dent in the rear quarter panel, the kind that comes from a parking garage pillar, a clean 4-inch crease. I was in the mudroom when he came in, and I asked him about it. I want to be careful about how I describe what happened next, because I have had to describe it several times since, and precision matters. He did not punch me. He put both hands on my chest and shoved me, hard and deliberate, backward into the doorframe between the mudroom and the kitchen. The corner of the trim caught my shoulder. I am 63 years old, and I spent 39 years framing houses, and I am not a small man, but the impact was hard enough that I grabbed the doorframe to stay upright. He told me the truck was fine, it was a scuff, I was overreacting, and that maybe if I spent less time worrying about old trucks and more time thinking about the company's future, we would all be better off. I looked up at the stairs. My daughter was at the top. She had heard all of it. I waited. I looked at her and I waited for something, a word, a step forward, anything. She looked at her husband, then at the floor. Then she went back to her room and closed the door. I straightened up. I walked to the kitchen and put the kettle on. I made tea I didn't drink, and I sat at the table until the house went quiet, and I thought about my wife, who used to say, "You never talk when you're planning. You go quiet the way the river goes quiet before it changes direction." I was planning. At 6 in the morning, I called my lawyer, a man I've worked with for 17 years. He is methodical and plain-spoken, and he has never once told me what I wanted to hear when the truth was something different. I told him about the accounts. I told him about the mudroom. He told me to come in at 8 and to bring Doris's folder. He read everything without expression. Then he picked up his phone and made a call, and by mid-morning I was sitting across from a forensic accountant who asked precise questions and seemed to find the numbers in front of her deeply interesting in a way that didn't suggest anything good for my son-in-law. By noon, the picture was clearer. The numbered company receiving the transfers had been incorporated in Ontario 8 months earlier. The director of record was my son-in-law. The transfers totaled $61,000. There appeared to be a second account, not in Ontario, where funds were being moved from the numbered company. The forensic accountant flagged it and said she had seen this pattern before. My lawyer called a private investigator he had used on an estate matter 2 years prior. The man was a retired OPP officer who looked like he had heard every possible version of every possible story and found all of them entirely predictable. He told me he would have preliminary results in 10 days and that I should go home and act normal. Acting normal is harder than it sounds when you know what you know. I went home and ate dinner and passed the potatoes and said nothing. My son-in-law talked about a podcast he was listening to about passive income. My daughter cleared the plates. My granddaughter showed me the updated bracket her top pick had lost, and she was revising her methodology. I told her that adjusting your model when the data changes isn't failure. It's the whole point. She wrote that down in her notebook. The investigator called me on day 8 and asked me to come to his office. I drove down a highway, glittering with the first frost of October, the maples along the roadside already gone orange and red, the kind of color that tourists drive 3 hours to see, and I have been watching from this road for 39 years. It looked beautiful. It always does. I tried to let that be enough. He had a tablet with photographs. He told me to take my time. My son-in-law, having dinner with a woman I did not recognize at a restaurant in downtown Ottawa. My son-in-law at a hotel near the Rideau Canal on a Thursday when he had told my daughter he was visiting a client in Toronto. My son-in-law at the office of the development company that had been trying to buy our 4-acre parcel for 3 years, shaking hands, reviewing documents spread across a boardroom table, smiling the way a man smiles when he has already decided something. The last item was a screenshot from a text exchange, the investigator described as having been obtained within legal scope. My son-in-law had sent a message to a contact at the development company. It said, "She's on board with the transition. Once the property signs, I'll move the rest to the account in Vancouver. She doesn't know about Vancouver. She thinks we're saving the business and getting a fresh start somewhere new." I read it twice. Then I set the tablet down and looked at the frost on the window for a moment. My son-in-law was not just stealing from a company that 38 people depended on for their Friday paychecks. He was using my daughter as an unknowing instrument to transfer my property to a development company, and then he was going to take the money, and a woman she had no idea existed, and a Vancouver account she had never heard of, and disappear. He was going to leave my daughter holding the transfer documents she had helped facilitate, and did not understand. In a life he had already planned to exit. He was going to rob me and use her to do it, and then leave her standing in the wreckage. I handed the tablet back and asked the investigator if he had enough for a formal report. He said he had enough to file a complaint with the OPP Financial Crimes Unit and support a civil fraud action. I told him to prepare everything and send it to my lawyer. I told my lawyer to make the call. A detective from the OPP Financial Crimes Unit reached me the following Tuesday. He was careful and methodical and asked his questions in a specific order that told me he had already reviewed more than I had sent him. I told him about the dinner. We hold an anniversary dinner every October, 39 years without missing one. We do it in the timber frame building at the back of the property, the first structure I ever built on this land, in 1989, with a crew of 4 and a set of plans I had drawn myself on graph paper. Every year at this dinner, I thank the people who have kept the company going, and we eat well and drink the local cider and remember what we are building toward. My son-in-law had been angling for months to make this year's dinner the occasion for a formal transition announcement. He had no idea how right he was going to be. I told the detective I was going to give him exactly what he was expecting. He said he could arrange for an officer and a colleague from the fraud division to attend. I said I would leave the side entrance unlocked. I want to tell you about the night before the dinner because it nearly came apart. I was in the workshop at 11 o'clock, the space going cold the way old timber frame buildings do when October gets serious, a kettle I had forgotten going lukewarm on the wood stove. My granddaughter had been put to bed at her regular time, but she had come downstairs around 9 and sat with me for a while at the workbench, working on a project she'd been developing for months, a complete arena design. Not a real NHL arena, she was specific about this distinction, but a community arena for a town that didn't have one. She showed me the latest addition, a warm room off the main rink for grandparents, with a clear sightline to the ice and a dedicated Tim Hortons machine beside the window. I told her that was the most thoughtful piece of architectural planning I had seen all year. She asked me if everything was okay. Children ask this directly and without warning, because they have not yet learned to pretend they did not notice. I told her everything was being handled. She said her father had mentioned they were probably going to be moving soon, maybe to Toronto, maybe somewhere far. She said it the way she delivers difficult information, very plainly, without a tremor, like reporting a penalty call she thought was wrong, but was prepared to sit with. I put my arm around her and told her she was not going anywhere. She looked at me for a moment with her grandmother's eyes, not checking whether I was right, but deciding whether I was being honest. Then she showed me the next room she was adding to the arena. A memorial wall for community contributors, small plaques and a reading bench running the length of it. She said every good building should have a place that remembers. I stayed in the workshop a long time after she went back upstairs. The day of the dinner, I was at the shop by 4 in the morning. The timber frame building was lit and ready by the time the crew began arriving through the afternoon. Doris was the first one in. She had known for 2 weeks that something was coming, not all of it, but enough. She touched my arm when she walked past and didn't say anything, which was exactly right. My lead framer, a man who had been with me for 27 years and who could read a set of plans upside down in dim light, set the long tables the way we always did. Proper linens, real plates, the kind of setup that costs more effort than money and means more for it. My daughter and son-in-law arrived at 6:30. My son-in-law was wearing a jacket that had no business at a timber frame dinner and carrying a leather folio I recognized as the one he kept his transition documents in. The partnership restructuring agreement, the property transfer, everything he had been preparing for months in anticipation of this evening. He believed tonight was the night I would hand him what he had been working toward. My daughter was quiet, moving through the room slowly as though she was memorizing it, or trying to name something she had been feeling for a long time without a word for it. My granddaughter was at a friend's house for a sleepover. I had arranged that 3 days earlier. Some things are not for children. At 7 o'clock, I stood at the head of the long table and thanked my crew for 39 years of anniversary dinners and for building things that would outlast all of us. I said that good timber frame work is honest work because the joinery either holds or it does not, and the wood does not care how confident you were when you cut it. A few people laughed. My son-in-law was watching the door with the expression of a man expecting exactly what he had planned for. I told the room I had a special guest tonight, someone I had invited to help formalize a significant transaction. My son-in-law straightened in his chair. He reached for the folio. He was arranging his face into something that communicated leadership and generosity, the expression of a man preparing to accept something graciously. The side door opened. 2 people walked in, a man in a dark jacket and a woman in plain clothes, who carried a small case and moved with the quiet authority of someone who has no need to announce herself. My son-in-law looked at them. I watched his face during the moment of recognition, that flicker of recalculation that he almost managed to suppress. The woman introduced herself, OPP Financial Crimes Unit, her colleague from the fraud division. The room went very still. My son-in-law stood up fast enough that his chair scraped across the floor. He said there was a misunderstanding. He said he didn't know what this was. He reached across the table for the folio, and my lead framer, a man who has not raised his voice in 27 years of working beside me, who communicates almost entirely through the quality of what he builds, placed his hand flat on it, not aggressive, just present. The folio stayed where it was. The detective asked my son-in-law to remain seated. He used a tone of voice that made the word, "please" mean something other than a request. My daughter had not moved. She was looking at her husband with an expression I had never seen on her before. I recognized it the way you recognize structural damage, not the crack itself, but what the crack tells you about everything that has been happening inside the wall where you couldn't see it. I reached into my jacket and laid 3 documents on the table. I slid them down the linen until they came to rest in front of him. The first was the transfer records. 12 transactions over 8 months, all routed to the numbered Ontario company, bearing his name on the registration. The second was the documentation for the Vancouver account, the one my daughter did not know existed. The third was the investigator's report, including the photographs and the text message. He read them. He looked at the officers. He looked at my daughter, and then he started talking. He said the numbered company was a legitimate tax planning structure he had been meaning to explain properly. He said the Vancouver account was a joint investment vehicle, something they had discussed in general terms. He said the meetings with the developer were exploratory conversations, nothing signed, no agreement reached. He said the investigator had misrepresented the context, and that my lawyer had been feeding me a distorted picture constructed by people with a vested interest in protecting their own positions in the company. He was very good, I will give him that. Even cornered, he was still building something. My daughter looked at him while he spoke. Then she looked at me. Her voice was very quiet. She asked about the Vancouver account. She asked if there was a woman. She asked me to show her the third page of the investigator's report again. I slid it toward her. She read it. The room was quiet enough that you could hear the October wind working at the old timber frame, the building settling and resettling the way it has for 39 years, the way it will for another 100 if no one does anything foolish to it. She set the page down very carefully, the way you set down something you are not sure will survive being handled. She looked at her husband and said his name once. One word, spoken the way you close a door you do not intend to open again. He tried 3 more versions of the story, each one faster, each one thinner, each one running into the silence that the room held up against him like a wall that wasn't going anywhere. My crew said nothing. The officers said nothing. Doris came in from the side room, set a mug of coffee in front of my daughter without a word, and went back to her desk. I said nothing. I had already said what I needed to say, standing in a cold workshop at midnight, and I had decided it would only be said once. When he finally ran out of road, I stood up. I walked to his end of the table. I stood in front of him, and I said what I had prepared. I said, "You put your hands on me in my own mudroom. You did it in front of my daughter, and you assumed she would say nothing, because you had spent 2 years teaching her that your comfort came before her conscience. You stole $61,000 from a company that 38 people bring their families home from every single Friday. You were negotiating to sell land that was not yours to sell, while you wired money to a city my daughter had never heard mentioned, for a life you were building without her. You used her as cover, and you planned to leave her holding the paperwork when you walked out." I said, "And then you called yourself family." He had nothing. For the first time since I had known him, he had absolutely nothing at all. The detective asked him to step outside with his colleague. He went. He did not fight it. The argument was gone, because the argument had only ever been leverage, and he had none left. My daughter sat at that table for a long time after he was gone. The crew filtered out quietly, the way good people do when they understand that a family needs space. Doris brought the coffee pot around once more without saying anything unnecessary, and that was the right call. I sat across from my daughter. She had both hands around the mug. She asked me how long I had known. I told her. She asked if she had known, somewhere underneath it all, that something was wrong. I did not answer that question because it was not mine to answer. It was hers. She would be working on it for a long time, and the honest thing was to let her. She asked about her daughter, about my granddaughter. I told her she was at a sleepover and would be home in the morning and would be perfectly fine, because she had her grandmother's eyes and a community arena design that was nearly ready for its 3rd complete revision, and an ongoing argument with the concept of losing that I found very encouraging. My daughter made a sound that was almost a laugh, not quite, but almost. I am going to move past what came next, because the legal proceedings, the fraud charges, the civil recovery action, the dissolution of a marriage, those are not mine to lay out in detail. They belong to my daughter, and she is moving through them with a steadiness I recognize, because it came from her mother. What I will tell you is what comes after, because that is what this is actually about. The frost is deep now. The ridge behind the shop has gone bare and silver gray in the November light, the same shade it turns every year at this time, the same shade it was the first autumn I watched it from this property. I sit in the shop in the mornings before the crew arrives, the way I have since I was 24 years old. Some mornings my granddaughter is here because she stays with me on weekends now, and she brings her notebook to the workup bench and works on the arena design while I review the day's plans. Occasionally she asks me to explain something structural, and I do, and she writes it down with the seriousness of someone who fully intends to use it one day. The company is running. We hired 2 new framing apprentices in September, young men who want to learn timber joinery the right way because they have figured out that the right way actually holds. The Vancouver account was frozen as part of the civil recovery action. My son-in-law reached a conditional arrangement with the Crown that I will not detail further, except to say the terms reflected what he had done. The developer's contact is cooperating in a matter that has grown considerably larger than what started in my shop. My daughter has a place of her own in town. She is working at a civil engineering firm, a position she earned through a portfolio she had been building quietly for years in the hours her husband had not filled with his own requirements. She is good at it, better than she knows yet. She will figure it out. The ridge is the same as it always was. The timber frame building at the back of the property is the same one I built in 1989, with 4 people and a set of graph paper plans, and it is going to outlast every version of this story. Here is what I know at 63. Sitting in a shop I built myself on land I own free and clear in a valley I have been watching for nearly 4 decades. Respect is structural. It is load-bearing. When the people around you treat it as optional, as something to be negotiated away piece by piece for convenience or comfort, they are not confused about what it means. They are counting on you to keep pretending that you are. I was the wrong bet. If this story found something in you, if you have ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping everything you built, please hit the like button and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Have you ever had to protect what you spent your life building from someone who called themselves family? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. Subscribe to Revenge Hours. Thank you for being here.